friends, and welcome to my August monthly reading wrap-up. I read 15 books this month, which I am pretty chuffed about, which is a total of 3,948 pages, which gives us an average of 263 pages per book. I read 9 fiction, 3 non-fiction, 1 manga, and 2 poetry books. In terms of the format that I read them, I read 7 physical books, 7 audiobooks, and 1 ebook. My average rating ended up being 3.83, which I think is really quite high. My lowest rating was 2, and I had 2 books that got 2 stars. But I had 4 books that got 5 stars and a couple with 4.5. I think that's all the stats we need to talk about. Let's get into discussing the books. So let's start with the 2-star books. The first is The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart by Holly Ringland. Now this is an Australian novel from a couple of years ago that is essentially about domestic violence and abuse. This one did come to me in the Wild Book Box, so if you'd like to watch the vlog where I read that, I'll leave that in the cards above. Basically our protagonist is Alice, and we meet her when she's about 7 years old, living with her abusive father and her mother. So it's very difficult to read, and at about the 50-60 page mark, something quite traumatic happens, which means that Alice has to go and live with her grandmother. And we as the reader discover quite a bit about June's story and history, as well as her mother, but then also about her son, who was Alice's father. And there has been a lot of trauma and abuse that the women all through Alice's family have experienced. And so that has fostered sort of like a culture of secrecy and silence, especially for June, Alice's grandmother. But obviously Alice has been through a lot, and as she gets older she wants to know more about her family and her history. And I understand that June's reluctance to talk to Alice about kind of like her family story does come from a place of trauma herself. But that's kind of like the main driving force in the story. I don't know, I just found it frustrating. I understand that the story was aiming to teach us about like the cycles of abuse and how people find themselves in those situations, what they do to somebody mentally, and how isolating that experience can be. But the rest of it and the characters just didn't interest me. Okay, now for our second book, and this is The Strays by Emily Bitto. So this is another Australian novel, and it is set in Melbourne throughout last century. Basically it tells the story of Lily, who is someone who comes from a pretty like basic family, very working class, kind of very traditional. But her best friend growing up is Eva, and she comes from a family of artists and radicals. And her parents are both artists, and they live in this big house because they've kind of come into wealth. And they end up sort of developing like this artist commune where a bunch of like younger up and coming artists like just move in and live and make art all day. And Lily ends up spending quite a lot of time at Eva's and even ends up living there for almost a whole year when her father gets ill. I'm going to talk about like vague spoilers, so I'm not going to explicitly talk about the events, but I'm going to talk about themes and sort of feelings, I guess. Basically, to me, this is a book that highlights really bad parenting and in some ways child grooming. But at the end of the book, the conclusion that is drawn is sort of like this sympathetic view of Eva's mother as somebody who just always wanted siblings but never had them. Like, I don't know, it just didn't feel satisfying to me, and I'm left kind of feeling like I don't understand why I read the book. Like, what was the point of it? I don't know. Like, I'm not someone who's opposed to depicting that sort of stuff in books altogether. Like, I'm not mad because there was child grooming and shitty parents, you know? I'm frustrated that it didn't feel like it mattered. It just sort of felt like it was glorifying quirky, eccentric people. Also, trigger warning for on-the-page suicide attempt. That was rough. I will say I did quite like some of the writing, and I did enjoy that it was set in Melbourne. Okay, now for 3 stars. This was the 4th volume of Skullface Bookseller Honda-san by Honda. Now this is a manga series, it's just a short one. This is the final volume in the series, and it is a series that I love. The first volume in this series is one of my favorite mangas that I've read, and the series is basically just full of like little anecdotes and experiences of what it's like to work in a bookstore, and it's very comedic. The 4th volume, however, I did still enjoy it because I love Honda and I love the whole thing, and being a bookseller there's a lot that I identify with, but this one I felt like it's a bit of a stretch to call this a 4th volume. More than anything, it's bonus material. If I was being pessimistic and a bit mean, I might call it a cash grab. It was supposed to be a 3-part series, and Honda left the bookshop at the end of the 3rd part, so she didn't have anything else to write about. But the publisher because it had been quite successful, wanted a 4th volume. So the 4th volume is basically just Honda talking about how she doesn't have a story, anything to write about. So she kind of goes around and interviews people in the book industry hoping to find a story. And I did find it a little bit interesting and fun because she does talk to people like in the publishing industry specifically a little bit more than just booksellers. So I found that a bit interesting, and there were like a few moments where I laughed out loud. It was fun and I liked it, but I would only recommend it to people who love the series and just want like that tiny little bit extra of Honda. Now for our 3.5 ratings. Now these are getting to the books that I really did enjoy. So the first was the sort of poetry collection, I think, that I got through Libro FM, and it was All Along You Were Blooming, Thoughts for Boundless Living. And this sort of was like poetry, but letters to the author's readers, I think, is the sort of feeling that I got. Like it was, most of it was spoken in second person. So it felt like the author was talking to you. And so in that sense, it almost felt like sort of like uplifting, not prayer, but like motivational, like little mantras or something. It was really affirmative. I think affirmative would be the best word I could think of to describe this. And I just found it really calming and hopeful. And I was listening to this at a point in time where I had a lot of anxiety going on, and I ended up putting this on a couple of times. Like when I couldn't sleep, I just put it on, and it really helped soothe me. So at this point, like I'm not even really taking in the words, but something about the narrator on the audiobook, but then also just how gentle and affirming it is, it just helps me calm down a little bit. I don't know if that makes any sense, or if anybody else does that, where you just kind of like have these comfort things that you put on. For a long time, mine was the audiobooks of Harry Potter, but I'm still just a bit too mad about J.K. Rowling to enjoy that at the moment. So this has been wonderful for me lately. Now this next one I also got from Libro FM. Thank you, Libro FM. This was A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. And this is a very lyrical, beautifully written memoir, I suppose, from an Indigenous Canadian. He refers to himself as Indian, so it is a lot about colonialism and the experience of race, and then also he's queer. So it is a very beautiful, moving exploration of the intersection of those things. And as much as I enjoyed this, and as great a narrator as he was, I do sort of feel like I didn't get as much from it, and I feel like that has a lot to do with the fact that I listened to it on audiobook rather than reading it. Part of that also was because my anxiety was quite high at the time I was listening to this, and so I struggle with comprehension a little bit then anyway, but I do think that I would have gotten more from this and taken more of his message really deeply in me if I had the opportunity to kind of like read over things and highlight them and annotate them, if that makes sense. But I did still enjoy the audiobook, and I'm really glad that I had an opportunity to listen to it. What I really enjoyed about this book not only was just like how unflinching and raw it was, but also, I suppose as an Australian, it was a really good reminder of how like settler colonialism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of that stuff is still so prevalent and toxic in a country like Canada. And I think given, you know, like Daddy Trudeau and everything, like Canada, and also just by virtue of being next door to the US, I think Canada has really benefited from some really positive, like progressive PR. And it was just really powerful. It was beautiful, but really powerful. And I did also like how the author sort of played a little bit with form. Like most of it was just prose, but there was also, especially towards the end of the book, some poetry as well. And another audiobook from Libro FM. This one was The Voting Booth by Brandy Colbert. And this was a really good YA story. I don't read a lot of YA, but I did really like it. And our whole story takes place on one day, and that is election day in the US. And we get two different perspectives, two main narrators. That is Marva, who's like an overachieving A++ student who's very, very excited and passionate about her very first election day. And then there is Duke, who goes to a different school in the same area, who is also pretty passionate about voting, but perhaps not as passionate as Marva. And basically what happens is Duke tries to vote, but he is not on the register. And Marva overhears this, and like she is very passionate about like getting people to vote. So she spends the whole day trying to help him vote, basically. And so through this story, we learn a lot more about these characters' backstories and their family histories. Both are black, so it's also a story about race, but both have very different experiences of blackness and also of class. And then also topics of like voter suppression in the US and police brutality are explored as well. I really enjoyed how the different intersections of identity were explored, not like always explicitly, but through the relationships with different characters in the story. So for example, Marva's boyfriend is white, and he's pretty progressive, but he's decided that he doesn't want to vote, and Marva really struggles with that. I also did really like how the relationship between Duke and Marva evolved. I thought it was really realistic and respectful. It was really nice to watch. Okay, now on to the 4 stars. The first 4-star book was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This was another book in the Wild Book Box. So if you've watched that vlog, you know how I feel about this book. For me, it started out kind of slow and like the romance element was a little overdone. However, the writing and the development of those characters for me was really satisfying and interesting, so that by the end of the book, I really, really enjoyed it. Basically, it is a retelling of the myth of Achilles, but it is told from the perspective of Patroclus. And he and Achilles meet when they're young boys and they end up developing a relationship. And they're basically soulmates. And then when they finally do go to the war of Troy, the most interesting part of that book for me was when we're at the War of Troy and how the war changes both of these men, and therefore also changes their relationship. It kind of really brings to the fore what they both value and what's important to them, and also kind of really questions and challenges particularly Achilles and his identity. The next book I'm going to talk about was How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones, and this is another audiobook that I got from Libro FM. And this was basically like a coming of age memoir, I guess, of a black gay man living in the South of America. And I love this audiobook. The author does narrate the book himself, and his voice was beautiful. He was the son of a single mother and he adores his mother, but they have a very strained communication relationship, I guess. Like they love each other very much, but there's just so much that they struggle to say to each other. And so that's a big part of his story. We also learn more about his like high school and then university or college experience, and kind of really starting to explore his sexuality, and also how his blackness influences him understanding and exploring his gay identity as well. His writing was really sensual, and I think that's what I really liked about it, and it certainly came through in his voice. It was beautifully done. But obviously there was also a lot of, really challenging subjects tackled as well. And he did so with such like a gentle vulnerability that was really beautiful to witness. I also really enjoyed the kind of exploration, especially towards the end, of his relationship with his uncle as well. And I also really liked the way he explored like masculinity and what that means as well. It was really good. Now this next one I've heard a lot about, but I wasn't really thinking of picking up except for the fact that I got it through Libro FM's ALC program. Through their influencer program, basically, I was able to get a copy of this audiobook. I figured it would just be a good like palate cleanser, lighthearted sort of a read. It certainly was all those things, but it had a lot more depth to it than I was expecting. This is basically the story of Eileen, who I think is 79, and her granddaughter, Lena. And they're both just having a bit of a rough time, so they end up deciding to switch lives. So Eileen moves to London and goes to live in Lena's flat and starts like internet dating, and it's all very risque and fun. Whereas Lena moves out to the country into like a little town to kind of just like shut off from work for a couple of months and chill. So it's a fun setup, but underneath all of it is a lot of grief, because a year prior to this happening, Lena's sister passed away from cancer. And I knew pretty early on what was going to happen in terms of the romance for both of these women, but it was done in a really like satisfying way, and it was just a really fun book that was both really funny and comedic, but also had so much heart to it. Like it was a great balance. So it didn't change my life or anything, but I did really enjoy it for what it was. Now for our 4.5 stars. Oh, these books were good. The first is a long title, Sia Martinez and the Moonlit Beginning of Everything. I love that title. Isn't it so dreamy? This was such a fun, unexpected, but still like so much heart and very moving book. This was another one that I got the audiobook from Libro FM. I'd never heard of it before. And this book blended so many things beautifully together. Like it's like this contemporary YA with a bit of romance, but also turns into a sci-fi novel halfway through, and it deals with things like immigration and race in America. Basically, Sia is a teenager living in the south of America, and she lives with her father. Her mother attempted to cross the border to kind of get back to her family, but she went missing and was never found. I sort of don't want to say too much about the story because I went into it knowing almost nothing, and I loved that I did because the way that it unfolded was just really unexpected. But I cannot recommend this book enough, and I really enjoyed the audiobook in particular. Sia is such a good, well fleshed out, well-rounded character, and I love the way that like a sense of place is evoked in this. And Sia has like she really weaves in folklore and spirituality into her worldview as well, that she's been taught by her mother and her grandmother, and the way it's all weaved together just works so well. And it certainly explores like the ideas of illegal immigration and the experience of immigrants in America and the harm done to families, but also it's sci-fi, so it's just fabulous. It's fabulous, and the audiobook was brilliant. Okay, now for the final audiobook that I got from Libro FM. This is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. And this is a story that takes place over just 3 days. It is set in 1918 in Dublin, in the middle of a pandemic. It's basically the story of Nurse Julia, who is a nurse in the middle of Dublin, in the middle of a pandemic, but she works in the maternity ward for women who have signs of flu. So any symptoms of flu, they kind of get sent down if they're pregnant to this ward to be taken care of and to have their babies. And also with the war and everything else going on, resources are really tight. So Julia doesn't have a lot of help and she doesn't have access to a lot of stuff. So it's just like really dire circumstances. And a lot of the nurses that Julia would normally work with are also sick. So she's working the maternity ward by herself. But then she gets sent a helper who doesn't know anything about medicine or anything. Brandy, who's just kind of like this sweet young girl who just wants to help. I shouldn't say she's a young girl, but she is a bit younger, I think, than Julia. And she just comes across as very naive. She's very sweet. A lot of like explicit detail of like a childbirth. But then in this really high stakes environment, it's also about like the relationship that these women form, both Julia and Brandy, but the relationship she has with her patients and other doctors as well. And even though, yes, I saw the ending coming, I still really enjoyed it and I couldn't put it down. It was really compelling and fast paced, all kind of packed into 3 days. It was really intense, but Julia was a great protagonist and I just really enjoyed it. Okay, and now for the 5-star books. There are 4 books left, so let's get stuck in. The first was just a short story and it was The Hurt Pattern. I read this, it was for the Short Story Club. I really enjoy short stories, but I often find that they kind of end up being, like the ones that I really like, they end up being like 4 stars. Like it's not very often that a short story I feel like packs enough punch to get a 5-star from me. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I do really enjoy them, but it takes a lot for me to like love them. I loved this one. And because it's a short story, I don't want to give too much away because, you know, like short stories, like they unfold very quickly. But it is kind of like a near-ish future dystopia, I guess, which really focuses on race, police brutality, and also capitalism. It's basically about algorithms and surveillance and technology, and how all of those things could, in theory, or might even now, be being used in ways that are really oppressive and harmful. And also who benefits from those things. I don't know. It was just really good. I loved it. So if you get a chance to read it, please do. It's only like 20 pages, but it was really good. Now for another short book. This one I did read in physical copy though. This was Living on Stolen Land by Ambelin Kwaymullina. And this is about Australia and our settler colonial history and present. And it's interesting because it sort of looks like poetry. It's written in sort of like verse. And it's described as a manifesto, but it is so easy to read. It is so direct and uncompromising in its language and its presentation. And basically it just like explicitly and very clearly discusses everything from colonialism to racism to bias to solidarity and how that can be helpful and harmful. It just felt really like revealing, and I just felt so impassioned and motivated after reading it. It felt to me, I think I've described it before, it sort of felt like a mantra, like something that you say to build power, to motivate people, to really invest in meaningful change in their lives and in their society. Like it was really well done. The Yield by Tara June Winch is another Australian novel, and it was the Blossom Book Club book, the book club that I host over on my Patreon. It was our book for the month of August. And this would, without a doubt, have to be my favorite book that we've read together. This was incredible. This is basically a story about Aboriginal identity and belonging to land, of family, of language, of history, of ancestry, of trauma, colonization, of land rights. It's a book that's told from 3 different perspectives, and it's just so beautifully done. Our main perspective is from August, who is a young Aboriginal woman who's been living in the UK for the last 10 years and comes home to her small town here in Australia after her Poppy has passed away. Our second perspective is Poppy. He knew he was going to die soon, so he started writing down a dictionary, more or less, and it is a dictionary of his Aboriginal language, which has more or less been lost. And so he is writing this dictionary to preserve it. But he doesn't just give us definitions of the words, like, like you would find in a dictionary. Instead, he explains the meanings of those words through telling his own story, or like elements and parts of his own story, and of the story of his family and his ancestors. And in the third perspective, it is a letter from a priest who ran a mission in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And through him, we really learn about like the history of colonialism in this area, and of the attempted genocide, the abuse, the trauma, the stolen generation, the stolen land, all of that. So these 3 perspectives unfold through the story, and it's just done in such an impactful way and in a really beautiful way. This, I think, will be one of my favorite books of the year. It's incredible. And finally, the last book is My Place by Sally Morgan. This is another book that I read for the Wild Book Box. It was in my second box, so I'll be talking more about that in my upcoming vlog. So I guess this is a big spoiler, but this book, oh my God, this is one of my new favorite books of all time. This is a memoir that was published back in 1987, and it is basically the story of a family, in particular 3 generations of women. Basically, they're Aboriginal, but they've kind of hidden that, and like that part of their history, they're completely cut off from that part of their family, in large part due to the policy of the stolen generation, but that has been perpetuated through the shame and fear that in particular Sally's grandmother has experienced. But as Sally gets older, she becomes very determined to discover more about her family and their history, and to uncover it and then to tell it. So Sally interviews like her mum, for example, and her one uncle that she's familiar with, to try and get more information, but to also record their stories and their experiences. So this book is not only about kind of like uncovering a history to find the truth. It's also about freeing a family from the silence that they've felt that they've had to kind of impose upon themselves to keep them safe, of doing away with the shame and the stigma that in particular these women have lived with, and also of reconnecting with other family members who like they didn't even know existed. So it's absolutely incredible, and whenever I think about it too much, I just start crying, because I think the feat of putting this together was incredible, but also just how important and significant it is, not only in like the history of, telling Aboriginal stories from an Aboriginal perspective in colonial Australia, but also just of how significant that was for those women in particular. And their own development as human beings through this book is just like, it's palpable, it's moving, it's heartbreaking, it's inspiring, it's all of the things. It just gave me so many feels. I absolutely loved it. It was just incredible. It was absolutely incredible. So thank you so much to the Wild Book Box for picking that book for me, because it was amazing. But my mouth hurts from talking so much. Those are our 15 books. I'm pretty impressed with myself. 15 is a pretty good number for me. It's not the most I've ever read in a month, but it's a pretty solid number, I think. Before we go though, I have to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of your support. I really do appreciate it. And a big thank you goes to Tracy Timmerman, Laurie, Lynette Brown, The House K, and Carly Gravatt for your above and beyond support. It means so much. Thank you. And thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed hanging out with me, chatting books. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye.